It's funny, when you do it this way, which is always the way I do it, it looks very foreign and as though it might be interesting to know, but it doesn't actually have anything much to do with you, right? But in fact, the reason why we're still reading Sophocles and others is that it has an enormous amount to do with us. You could say the doubleness of this word. I think I did this last week, but think about it in this way. If you understand, as when we're pushed to it, we frequently do, because it's the sort of political philosophy that was with us at the beginning. We think of, we talk, if you study, early modern political philosophy, we talk about the state of nature. We talk about the state of nature as a pre-political, pre-conventional order that we desperately want to escape because, I quoted you the famous line last time from Hobbes, life in the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and a continual war of everyone against everyone else. What that really means, though, is echoed in hundreds of science fiction movies when you watch what's supposed to happen when political life disappears all of a sudden. It gets scary. It's supposed to get really scary. And that's what Hobbes really is appealing to try to help us understand what's so important about politics. And it's in a way what's present in the Stasimon that we looked at last time. It's why the polis is thought to be, in a way, the most important human artifact. It makes it possible to live like a human being. But the difficulty, the danger with it is that the more successful it is in distancing us from a situation that's scary, the less scared we are. Naturally, that makes perfect sense, right? So it erects a barrier between us and all the things that terrify us. And therefore, perfectly understandably, one becomes inclined to sort of take it for granted, that it will always be there, that it always was there, that it is invulnerable, and in a way, what the Stasimon tries to get you to see is that problem is built into the double character of the deinos, that it means both clever or canny and uncanny, that you wouldn't need to be clever unless there were lots of things to be afraid of, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the further you get from being afraid of things, the less you understand this driving need to be clever. So there's something self-undermining. There's a tension built in political life that it can easily fall prey to. So yes, it's about Antigone, and her name's it means anti-birth, but it looks in a way as though when you look at it that way, it's a sort of interesting old story, but actually it's not an old story at all. It's a perennial story. Now, I think what we need to get to at some point, for some reason, the Greeks, or let's not say that, we shouldn't say that. For some reason, the tragedians whom we study, it's taken for granted, patriarchy, all of that is quite, sensible and understandable on the one hand. And on the other hand, this, in a way, one of the most patriarchal, that's not quite true, but certainly a patriarchal society. Women weren't good women, not the other sorts of women, but respectable women weren't allowed out of by themselves, right? So understood in that way, you could say everything that we are inclined to find deeply problematic, it was certainly present in Athenian culture in the 5th and 4th centuries, on the one hand. On the other hand, we've now read plays, almost 3 plays by 2 of the great tragedians, and it turns out that in some way, this doubleness of the Denos is what's fueling their understanding of the world. They're very much aware of the fact that the political, the overtly meaningful, that the creons of the world are in a way in control, and at the same time, they insist on the fact that the deeper understanding of the Denos is what they understand to be the feminine understanding. So at the very least, if you want to understand them, you have to try to understand why they did that. What does it mean that they did that? I keep coming back to it when I talk to you by trying to remind you that if you look at the Oresteia, if you look at it, if you were to watch the 3 plays together, you would come away you could come away thinking that far and away the single most impressive character in the trilogy is Clytemnestra. He's a great poet. He knew he was doing that on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're always in a situation where what they're understanding to be the most important is suppressed, invisible. There's something peculiar about it. That will turn out to be true in Antigone as well. That's what it means conventionally. That's what it's taken to mean. So if a woman has either lost a child or had a miscarriage, it's possible to name the next child. If a male, Antigonus. If a female, Antigone. Because this prefix, anti, can mean in place of. So born in place of another. But of course, something moved you to ask the question. So even if the word isn't there, the thought, something like the thought is there. And it's, so I have and will continue to hit rather harder when we're talking about this play, the fact that the literal meaning of her name is anti-birth. I have, you know already, some of my reasons for doing that, because it's the strange connection between her and death. But I think it would be foolish to ignore the more conventional meaning of the name. And so what you just mentioned is worth trying to think through. That's a nice way of saying I don't know what to do with it, but it strikes me as something that one might want to do something with. Let's go back to last time. We saw that 3 things had to be put together about Antigone. That she's the offspring of an incestuous marriage, that she champions the family over and against the city, and that she is said to be in love with death. Now, we saw last time that her love of death pointed to this word, denos, canny, uncanny. So it pointed to the capacity to face obstacles and ultimately death without yet having any devices to fend these obstacles off. So denos, understood as uncanny, terrible, awesome, versus denos, understood as canny, clever, artful. Now, at the same time, this was connected to the family insofar as Antigone's pure devotion to family posed the problem of incest. You could understand it in this way. The principle of the family, love of one's own, makes generation impossible because on the one hand, if you purify it, if you absolutize it, love of one's own means that you can't go outside the family to generate children, so nothing of what's called exogamy. And on the other hand, you can't generate children incestuously and preserve the family because the double roles that inevitably arise when you have incestuous matches means that the lines within the family get confused and the family is in a way no longer the family. So it turned out last time that the pure family, Antigone's pure family, the family she wishes to celebrate, is not possible in the world, but in a way is only possible as a kind of abstract principle. And the way I put it last time is it's only possible in Hades. Hades, which etymologically in Greek, and the poets play on this all the time, is aedes, which means the invisible place, which is on the one hand a place, but on the other hand like no other place in the world. Now, this in turn points to this problem that we sort of ended with last time, that, that'll never work, right? That the family ordinarily has a mother and a father, and then children. In this case, the mother is Jocasta, the father is Oedipus, and the children are Polynices, Eteocles, Antigone, and Ismene. So the intercourse of mother and father give you these children who were thereafter related in this horizontal way. But in fact, if we're talking about the pure family, and the pure family is possible only in Hades because the pure family doesn't admit of generation, either outside or inside the family, that means that you got to do away with this, and all you have left is this, and that, of course, looks suspiciously like the way the city understands itself. Antigone's family is like the ordinary understanding of the fraternal sororal bonds that are supposed to exist within political life. Now, there's another way of getting at this worth looking at. One of the peculiarities of this play is the extraordinary emphasis, mostly coming because of Creon, the extraordinary emphasis on money. So for example, and forgive me, all I can give you is the old numbers, but these are the numbers I have. So on the one hand, 221 or 240, and we get this. Yes, indeed, those are the wages, but often greed has with its hopes brought men to ruin. That's Creon. And then a couple of pages later, 294, 325, we get this, more extensive. Creon says, I am very sure that these men hired others. I tell you the worst currency, the word there is not currency but nomos, the worst law or convention, that ever grew among mankind is money. This sacks cities, this drives people from their homes, this teaches and corrupts the minds of the loyal to acts of shame. This displays all kinds of evil for the use of men, instructs in the knowledge of every impious act. Those that have done this deed have been paid to do it, but in the end they will pay for what they have done. And then much later, at line either 1034 or 1093, we get this. This is Creon again, talking to Tiresias now. Old man, you are all archers, and I am your mark. I must be tried by your prophecies as well. By the breed of you I have been bought and sold and made a merchandise for ages now. But I tell you, make your profit from silver, gold, from Sardis, and the gold from India, if you will. But this dead man you shall not hide in a grave, not though the eagles of Zeus should bear the carrion, snatching it to the throne of Zeus itself. Even so, I shall not tremble at the pollution to let you bury him. So the claim is that Tiresias has been bribed. Okay, so that's Creon. That's his view. What's so bad about money? Interesting, by the way, is that he says when it's the worst currency, I think your translator says, but the Greek is nomos, which means law or custom. So it can be written or unwritten law. And then a common word for currency or money, nomisma, which it derives from it, right? So makes a certain sense that we know that money is in a way conventional, and that this both come from a verb, nomidzein, which means to hold or to believe in an open, public way, not a sort of private belief, but to hold something. So Creon says it's the worst nomos that ever grew. That's interesting. The worst conventions are things that we make up, that we establish artificially, that ever grew. Things that grow are natural. So he points to it as, I don't think Creon knows quite he's doing this, but he points to it as strangely, simultaneously both conventional and natural. He says it sacks cities because greed, selfishness becomes more, devotion to oneself becomes more important than the common good. And yet, money is something that's invented by cities. It makes exchange possible. You could say, in a way, it then is it's simply the most general example of the double meaning of the word deinos. Let's start over. Money is something conventional, but it appeals to something natural. It seems to point to the power of the city. I mean, if you don't have political life, you don't have money, properly speaking. But beneath the surface, it points to what political life both rests on the one hand, and has to combat, on the other hand, in order to survive. So it turns out not to be an accident that the god of death, Hades, is also in Greek called Plutos, which also means wealth. So money is a convention necessary to tame human desires, which at the same time points to the fact that human desires are not simply conventional and are in a way not limited the way money is limited. So it's a little bit, I mean, it's like other profound conventions. One of the, really not one of the, from my experience, the single best interpreter of Greek tragedies was Seth Benardete. And I remember he once lectured on Antigone in this room. I invited him in the earlier version of you guys sitting out there. So he was at the podium and walked up, and virtually the first thing he said was, the fundamental question of Antigone is, why do we bury dead bodies? Why don't we just throw Grandma out with the garbage? You know, Grandma's dead. Okay, well, we better get rid of her. But we wouldn't even think of doing that. So it turns out that it's very important, and it's important in this play, that burial rituals, or what you do with the dead when they die, varies enormously, and it will be important if you burn them or bury them, or you can think of other ways. Herodotus points out that there are certain tribes that eat them ritually, you know, and you can understand that, right? There's sort of the symbolism of it is clear to you, that you, by consuming your parents, you're in a way preserving them in yourself. So you need to work it all out, but we do something with them. We don't just toss them out with the garbage, even though a part of us wants to say, you know, we don't, especially not at your age, you're not, some of you have, but probably not a lot of you have actually seen somebody die. It's really interesting. I mean, it's sad too, but it's also really interesting, because you come to meet, you know, it doesn't make you a sort of naive believer in soul, but you do realize that a minute ago something was there and now it's not there anymore. And there's a huge difference between what you were looking at 5 minutes ago and what you're looking at now. You have, on the one hand, kind of flaccid flesh, and on the other hand, there's something in there is a weird way of talking about it. It's not in there, but when it's gone, it's gone. So it's easy to imagine that you could believe that when it's gone, there's a passage at the end of Plato's Phaedo where, after Socrates had presumably made these powerful arguments for the immortality of the soul and that it's different from the body, his friend Crito says, what do you want to do? What do you want us to do with you after you die? And Socrates laughs and says, well, you know, if you can catch me. And then he points out to his students present, because Crito is his old friend, that Crito hasn't been affected by anything he's been talking about. So in a way, this Socratic tendency would say, well, why not the trash can? That's a possibility. We don't even do that with dogs, by the way. I mean, you can't, I don't know how many of you have been dog owners, but I think there's a gradation of pets. Gerbils, I think you can toss with and fish, certainly, either down the toilet or in the garbage. You can't do it with cats, although I frankly would do it with cats, but you can't do it with cats. You certainly can't do it with dogs. They need some kind of ceremony in order to indicate that they're, well, anyway, you understand all this. Okay, so back to money. It's like burial in the sense that burial, or something like burial, is a universal convention. And because it's a universal convention, it calls attention to the fact that there's something that it points to that isn't conventional. But to understand that means necessarily to call into question the value of money. You put it most simply, you don't want money. You want what it points to, ultimately. I mean, if I wish I could take a $100 bill out of my wallet. probably I could manage a 20 if I had to. But there's a way in which if you saw it on the street, you'd probably pick it up because it's worth something on the one hand. On the other hand, when you think about what it is, it's a piece of paper. You don't care about the paper. It's a sort of, if you ever needed proof for how important symbolism is in our life, money would be the easiest example, because in and of itself, it doesn't mean anything. It only means something if it's somehow backed up. In order for it to be backed up, you need political life. But even when it's in force, what this points to is that it's not it that you want, it's what it points to that you want. And in fact, the fact that it points to something, as soon as you think about it, means that its value gets undermined for you. Now, what all of this points to is, in a way, the inner contradiction within the city itself. The problem with nomisma, currency, with nomos, with the polis, is that in order to be what they are, they have to appeal beyond themselves to some natural authority. But as soon as such an appeal is made, their own authority gets undermined. So when Creon's first speech begins, the very gods who created this catastrophe have set it right again, that's in a way the point. Now, once perceiving this weakness, there's an enormous temptation to try to overcome it. This comes out in Creon's attempt to divinize the city, to make it godlike. And in a way, this is the same as his attempt to imagine the city without money. I think the crucial thing about the play is that Antigone comes to see all of this far more deeply than Creon does, which is why she turns to a comparison, and we'll talk about in a moment, between Creon's law on the one hand and divine law on the other hand. Antigone sees the need for the polis, for law, to justify itself by some standard external to it. Just think about it in terms of law. I mean, it's odd, isn't it? Because when we make law, we have to, so imagine yourself sitting in a legislative body, and somebody says, I think we should have a law to do this. And then you all talk about it, right? When you talk about it, you have to say, well, I don't know if that's such a good idea, because if we did this, then that would happen, and that wouldn't be good. And somebody else says, but no, it would be important. And you have a debate, right? But what's governing the debate? There has to be some good that the law is meant to bring into being or to preserve. But as soon as that law is passed, of course, the law is the law. You don't give a reason for it. You don't say, well, no, you can't park here. Well, why not? That's just the law. And if you park here, you get a ticket. But that doesn't make any sense. I don't care if it makes any sense. That's the law. Now, that looks stubborn on the one hand, but it's not stubborn. It's perfectly sensible. That's the way the law has to work. Once it's established, it makes a claim to be the final authority. And yet, to establish it, you have to make an appeal for it in terms of something beyond it. But that means every time you make an appeal to what's beyond it, you have in fact undermined it, because you're claiming that it's not the ultimate authority. It's only a law because it does X. So it turns out that in a weird way, the law requires a natural ground in order to be justified, you can ask the question, is it a just law? Is it a good law? On the one hand. On the other hand, it can't be a law if it's constantly open to debate whether it's a good law or a bad law. So the very thing that makes it possible to establish it in its way undermines it if you push it. Now, this is a roundabout way. Turn to a roundabout way to get at this issue, the issue being Antigone and the law. Look at the strange metaphor we get at line 423, 466. This is the guard, the sentry, describing what happened after Antigone found the corpse unburied. She was crying out with the shrill cry of an embittered bird that sees its nest robbed of its nestlings and the bed empty. Isn't there something odd about that? What is she lamenting? What's just happened? It's the dust. Right? It's not Polynices, it's the dust. Polynices is the nest. The dust is what she sprinkled. That's what's gone. He's still there. She's lamenting the loss of the dust. And this is coming back to what you just said. It turns out that Polynices is the occasion for her action, but it's not so much his corpse as the burial that she sees herself as the mother of. Now look at 485 or 441, further down the page. This is Creon. You there that turn your eyes upon the ground, do you confess or deny what you have done? Yes, I confess, I will not deny my deed. And then to the sentry, you take yourself off where you like, you are free of a heavy charge. Now, Antigone, tell me shortly and to the point, did you know the proclamation against your action? I knew it, of course I did, for it was public. Now, we asked ourselves this question last time. It's interesting that we don't have any idea how Antigone hears the proclamation. We do know that Ismene did not tell her. Antigone just knows. Okay. Now, look at the long speech that she gives directly after this one at either 494 or 450 following. Divides into three with a concluding couplet. First section is about 4 lines long, the divine origin of law, and then the next section, about 4 lines long, necessity of Antigone's death, and then the next section about 3 lines, her lack of pain, and then finally 2 lines, her foolishness is only apparent, not real. Now, let me read the whole thing for you. Yes, it was not Zeus that made the proclamation, nor did justice, which lives with the gods below, enact such laws as that for mankind. I did not believe your proclamation had such power to enable one who will someday die to override God's ordinances, unwritten and manifest. They are not of today and yesterday. They live forever. None knows when first they were. These are the laws whose penalties I would not incur from the gods through fear of any man's temper. I know that I will die, of course I do, even if you had not doomed me by proclamation. If I shall die before my time, I count that a profit. How can such as I that live among such troubles not find a profit in death? So for such as me to face such a fate as this is a pain that does not count. But if I dared to leave that corpse from my mother, dead and unburied. That would have been real pain. The other is not. Now, if you think me a fool to act like this, perhaps it is a fool that judges so. Now, in the first part, she opposes the human law to divine law, and human punishment to divine punishment. But in between these two sections, she inserts an argument about the eternal character of these laws and their manifest or self-evident sanctity. Green has secure, but it's really manifest, self-evident. But Antigone has a hard time putting together the need for divine punishment with the self-evidence of the burial laws. So she's doing two things at once. On the one hand, by making these laws divine, she's appealing to a source beyond the law. And on the other hand, she wants to claim the law's self-evidently binding character. Now, in the second part, she goes on to connect her knowledge of divine punishment, divine justice, with her knowledge of her own mortality. Yes, I know I'll die. In neither case does she need anything like a proclamation to know her obligations. So Creon's response immediately after speech, the savage spirit of a savage father, is rather appropriate. He goes on to say, the chorus say that, and then he says, I would have you know the most fanatic spirits fall most of all. It is the toughest iron, or it is tempered iron, baked in the fire to hardness. You may see most shattered, twisted, shivered to fragments. I know hot horses are restrained by a small curb. So she's described in two metaphors, tempered iron and raging horses. The one is artificial, the other is natural. So without quite realizing what he's done, Creon has described Antigone in terms that point to this contradiction at the heart of law itself. Natural on the one hand, conventional on the other. So if Antigone were somehow to stand for law, it would account for a number of peculiarities. It would account for why she treats Ismene as sister as such. That's sort of what the law does. It always treats generic cases. It never treats specific cases. It would account for for the same reason, the way in which she equalizes Polynices and Eteocles. It would, in a way, account for her claim that her soul died long ago. The law, when you think about it, Aristotle actually says this in the third book of the Poetics, that the law can only be what it is because it doesn't have soul. If it has soul, it has interest. It has something that it wants, something that it longs for. It has to be neuter. But it can only be that if it's not ensouled, and then of course that leads to the fundamental problem of law, which is that it doesn't enforce itself, and therefore it needs to be enforced by a living agent, and as soon as you have a living agent enforcing it, you have to wonder about whether the agent brings its own interest to the enforcing of law. It would also account for Antigone's absolutely untroubled and certain demeanor. She's not filled with self-doubt in this play. So Antigone, you could say, somehow reveals to us the savage nature of the law. That's the passage I just read from the chorus, as opposed to its civilized nature. Think about it for a minute. Does she ever explain to anyone in this play how she knows what she knows? She acts without any calculation of what is good or useful. She simply does what she does. She never really attempts to persuade anybody. She states her case. She leaves it at that. Antigone behaves as though she were the law. Now, there is a problem with all of this looming. She doesn't seem to pay enough attention to her own line at 455, 499, where she talks about the gods' unwritten laws. Now, divine law really has to be unwritten because like the polis, the city, and like nomos, law, the character of writing, really of speech generally, of logos, is what it is something that points beyond itself. It is what it is by virtue of pointing to something other than itself. So, like the polis, insofar as speech, logos, has authority, in a way it undermines its own authority. Now, Antigone first presents divine law as something that governs her just as human law would govern her, except it's better. But it can't really function that way. Unlike human law, divine law would be divine precisely because it was self-grounding, self-supporting. Human law is exactly what isn't that. It always needs some justification apart from itself. So presumably, when confronted with divine law, there would be no need to ask, why obey? It would be somehow manifest. It would function with something like the inevitability of natural law in the sense of the physical sciences. And yet at the same time, we would be obliged to follow it out of choice. So acting in accordance with divine law would bring a kind of absolute certainty and no self-doubt. But that sort of certainty is inappropriate to any written law. Any written law always points beyond itself to some ground that justifies it. The ground may be absolute. The law is measured by the ground. You're allowed to ask, is this a good law? Is it a just law? So willy-nilly, Antigone is forced to reverse the way she first understands her action. So if you look at the line at 523, 576, you get this strange remark. Creon had said, my enemy is still my enemy, even in death. Antigone says, my nature is to join in love, not hate. Literally, it is not my nature to hate with, sun ekthein, but to love with, sum philein. So now, Antigone presents herself as doing what she does as a result of what she is, of her nature. And she makes no appeal beyond herself whatsoever. I am what I am. So by simultaneously appealing to law on the one hand and to her own nature on the other hand, she approximates the problem of divine law to which she's appealing. She presents herself as a sort of self-grounding law. Now, this is very reminiscent of the first Stasimon, where the earth was presented simultaneously as divine and as natural. Now, in any case, it's clear that Creon takes this challenge as the threat of the female. So if you look at 484 or 528, you get this. I swear I am no man, and she the man, if she can win this and not pay for it. And then, especially Creon's last words before Ismene enters at 524, 577, where he says, hold it, go then to the world below yourself, if you must love them. When I am alive, no woman shall rule. So literally, go down there if you must live and love them, but me living, a woman will not rule, which means either while I live, a woman will not rule, that's the translation that Green gives, or a woman will not rule me while I live. Now, this points to a picture of perfect autonomy that really belies where we all come from. Remember the line about Polynices, Antigone's line, the corpse from my mother. Creon's illusion that the city is self-caused, that it's autonomous, is at odds with the fact that he and all of us have been born. It turns out that in a way, mothers are Creon's enemy. So that helps us understand him. It doesn't point as easily as we might like to Antigone, who herself bears the name which means anti-generation. So Antigone points to the celebration of the family, and so necessarily of generation, but as a principle. Or put it somewhat differently, for Antigone, the emphasis is placed not on what comes before birth, but on what comes after death. The city is, of course, limited in both ways. The reason seems to be this. She points to what is a ground for the polis, and for that reason, can never be simply taken up into the polis. But by making it a principle, Antigone has already taken it up into the polis. So the mistake she makes is that she understands that she has to appeal to something beyond Creon's law, but in order to appeal to it, she appeals to it as divine law, as though divine law were the same thing as human law, except bigger, more important. It's exactly what would happen if you tried to capture in speech what underlies speech and make speech possible. So it looks as though Antigone is doomed to recreate Creon on a higher level because she's trying to make a fundamental principle to organize, maybe even to deify, what has as its nature to resist human artifice. That's what Creon understands. That's the threat that Creon understands as the female, and it is really useful to think it through in terms of what happens in the Oresteia with Clytemnestra and with the Furies. One example, forgive me if I've used this example, it's a good example, so it's worth saying twice. But you could put the general problem sort of in this way. If I told you the story that Stephen Hawking tells, he tells a story about a lecture that the 20th century philosopher Bertrand Russell gave on cosmology. I think it was at Cambridge. So Russell is going on and making whatever point it was that Russell was making, and he's finished with the lecture, and there's a hand raised in the back, and a woman raises the question or makes a claim, well, that's all very well, Professor Russell, but I happen to know that the universe is supported because it sits on the back of a giant turtle. And Russell's sort of taken aback and says, really? What is the turtle on? And she replies very quickly, on another turtle. And he says, and that turtle? And she looks at him and says, oh, it's turtles all the way down, right? And it's a very funny story, and Hawking tells it in this way because he wants you to realize that, of course, it can't be turtles all the way down. You can't ask what the fundamental support of everything is and expect to give an answer that is like any other answer. So you're establishing the possibility for being. You can't, I mean, if you're within the context that you have set up, you could say, well, this is supported by this and this is supported by this, but then somebody says, well, wait a minute, what supports the whole thing? It can't be anything outside of it if it's everything. So what does it mean for it to have support? That's what Hawking is trying to get at. Martin Heidegger says more or less the same kind of thing when he says that you can't give an account of being as though it were a being. It's not like a particular being. So in a way, issues like this are floating around. This is the issue of the Deinos as uncanny. We have these things in the world. We have laws which are justified in terms of things that are outside of them. We have speeches which are meaningful because they point to things that are apart from speech. So let's just take speech as an example, since that's what half of you are probably writing on in the Oedipus at Colonus, same problem in a way. How is it possible to give an account in speech of what it is that makes speech possible, that grounds it? Presumably what grounds it exists apart from it, outside of it, makes it possible. It might be possible to point to it, but as soon as you say what it is, then that speech too will need to be grounded by a turtle. Can't be turtles all the way down. Can't be speeches all the way down. It can't be laws all the way down. That's what Antigone is pointing to. So Sophocles has done this rather marvelous thing. Antigone is so much deeper than Creon. Creon is a flat character. You know, he's in a way a cliche. Antigone sees much more deeply the fact that the family as she understands it gets transformed into something that looks suspiciously like the city has something to do with the fact that in her attempt to justify what grounds political life, to articulate what grounds political life, she turns that ground into another example of political life. Deeper, but the same thing. Divine law rather than human law, but still law. The Deinos clever or canny is our response to a situation that we're not in control of, that we stand before. We respond to something that's there, but it's not to be tamed. We can't give if we were to tame it, it would turn into the Deinos. Canny, clever, artful. The relation is that there's something eerie about what grounds speech, there's something eerie about what grounds law, and there's something eerie about the Deinos understood as the uncanny. It is interesting, by the way, that, and we've seen this in lots of contexts this semester, it is interesting that when you attempt to articulate this problem, that you should run very quickly into the gods. Because this double character of the gods, as on the one hand, meaning something, Gaia means earth, Uranos means heaven, Chronos means time, that on the one hand having meanings, and on the other hand being particulars, being persons, that you fit the two of them together in this way is in a certain way just a version of this doubleness of Deinos. The one pointing to the intelligible character of things, the other pointing to something that you need to try to articulate, but if you try to articulate it in any straightforward way, you're going to lose it. And so how do you articulate it? Poetry, tragedy. Tragedy is a weird way, brings the uncanny into political life in a controlled way. So when Nietzsche writes about tragedy in terms of the Apollinian Dionysian drives, he means something like this. It's the same problem in a way. And then Nietzsche was a trained classicist. He knew what he was doing. He makes Dionysus the god of, drunkenness and chaos and disorder, and Apollo the god of order, and so on and so forth. And it looks as though there are these fundamental principles that are at odds with one another. At one point he says that the greatest creation of the Apollinian drive in human beings is the creation of the Olympian gods. They are an Apollinian order. And then it's, if you think about it for a minute, you realize, wait a minute, Dionysus is an Olympian god. He's a weird Olympian god. He's the last of the Olympian gods, but he is an Olympian god. So what does it mean that in order to talk about the principle of chaos, you have to treat it like one of 12 orderly principles in the world? It is bizarre that in order to give voice to Dionysus, or whatever it is that Dionysus represents, you have to do it in an orderly Apollinian way. That's Nietzsche's formula for tragedy. Greek tragedy is Apollinian form, Dionysian content. We'll see that soon when we study the Bacchae. I think that's the last one we do. And striking thing is that the story of Dionysus is that that Semele is impregnated by Zeus, and at a certain point, and nobody believes her. They think that she's just, pregnant by somebody, some unknown. She insists it's Zeus, and so she at a certain point demands to see Zeus face to face, and he agrees, but of course the consequences of seeing him face to face is that she burns up. She's pregnant at the time, so he saves Dionysus and puts him in his knee, and Dionysus comes to be born out of Zeus's knee. The interesting thing about the play is that we learn all of this when an actor with a mask steps out on stage in the prologue and says, "Hi." Doesn't quite say hi, but "I'm Dionysus." We're confronted with looking directly at a god. That's what the play will turn out to be about. What does it mean? What might it mean to look directly at a god? Not by the way, important. I actually didn't do it intentionally. I realized it after I'd done it. I was describing Antigone's perspective and saying, she does what she does. I am what I am. And then I realized as soon as I said that, of course, that's the famous formula for Yahweh. That's what he says, I am that I am. Yes, I think that the interesting thing, and I have no doubt that Nietzsche knew he was doing this when he wrote The Birth of Tragedy. But the problem is that, and he, as I say, this is intentional, there's a way in which he wants to say every tragedy is about the same thing. And in a way, that's where my question, the one that you just alluded to, is pointing, and the remarks that I just made are pointing, on the one hand. On the other hand, Sophocles is a great playwright. Why would he write the same play over and over and over and over again? So it's very important to, as soon as you touch on that, to step back and say, wait a minute, what is the reason for the differences between the stories? I'm not going to answer that or even try to answer it right now, but I think that having seen what makes a tragedy, that's terribly important. One wants to hold on to that. And on the other hand, one wants to ask the question, why Agamemnon, libation bearers, Eumenides, Oedipus, Tyrannos, Oedipus Clonus, Antigone, one learns different things and one learns the same thing. And understanding what that means, that's the problem. Let me backtrack and put it in this way. If it were the case of any poem, and that's in a way what a tragedy is, that you could give a perfect and full interpretation of it, what do you need the poem for? I mean, why not just, the truth of the poem? Why can't we'll forget about the tragedy, you just come in and I'll tell you about the world, right? And I'll give you what I understand the meaning of these plays to be. So on the one hand, that's obviously preposterous. There's something that is never quite reproduced in the interpretation. And I don't by this mean to say, I think it's just too easy and it's a cheap way out to claim, oh, well, poems are infinitely interpretable and you can do them in any way you want to and each generation will do it in its own way. And isn't that wonderful? That's just another way of saying they're meaningless. You can do whatever you want with them. You can't do whatever you want with them, but you're never quite satisfied with what you do with them. What's that all about? What does it mean that you're never quite satisfied with what you, and I think this has to do with what we've been pointing to, that you, in trying to articulate what you know in a certain way is in principle inarticulable. And if you do it perfectly, you've destroyed it. It's not a surprise that you would have to delicately come at it in very different ways in order to get hints of what you're talking about. So it turns out that Plato knew this too, but if you read sort of conventional Platonic scholarship, you get an account of Plato as the guy who threw the poets out of the political order, and that he creates a war, describes a war between philosophy and poetry, which philosophy is supposed to win. He knows that's not, I mean, what Platonic philosophy is about the absolutely essential character of the mixture when you're talking about the deepest things of poetry and philosophy. You can't talk about the deepest things in the way you talk about everything else. Heidegger's, you can't give an account of being as though it were a being. on the one hand, and then you realize, well, you can't give an account of anything unless you give an account of it the way you give an account of everything else, and therefore, what's he talking about? Well, it has something to do with the difference between the sort of flat, prosaic way of thinking about things and the understanding of the need to talk about them poetically or metaphorically. So, as many of you are coming to realize because I force you to admit it, not because you've actually believe it yet, but you will, that's what Aristotle's Poetics is all about. And that's why it's not just a praise of poetry, but it is poetically written, even though it looks like it's dry as dust. It is, in fact, extraordinarily poetic in its presentation. And it has to be, because talking about these things, that's the only game in town. Yeah, don't sell them short, though. I mean,
I'm not.
It turns out that all poetry fails.
Yes, that's my point.
Tragic poetry is about the necessary failure of poetry. And so it's remarkably self-conscious in what it's doing. That's really, one strand of Aristotle's Poetics. That's what it's about. All poetry fails because all of its accounts are excessively orderly, beautiful. You have to frame the world in order to think about the world, but the world doesn't come in frames. So you have to give things a beginning, middle, and an end, treat them as though they have the possibility for a certain kind of intelligibility, and it turns out that that is a falsification of the world and a falsification of our experience of the world, on the one hand. On the other hand, tragedy, that's really interesting, says Aristotle, because it places, the frame that it places around things is a frame that is a frame about failures. It's literally about failures. It's about errors that are made on the basis of this beautification that goes into our experience. So there is a way in which they really understand very deeply what they're doing. And the reason I want to dig in my heels a little bit is to say, I think you make too clean a distinction between the act of poetic making and the act of analysis. Aristotle, in the passage we never get to, chapter 18, says every play is made of a tying of the knot and an unraveling of the knot, that it's much more common for for poets to be able to tie the knot well, for them to unravel the knot well. But the word that he uses for unraveling is lusus, which is the root of our word analysis. So the thing about tragedies is they contain within them a tying up of a problem, making complex of a problem, and an unraveling or analysis of it in the play itself. That's Aristotle's view. I mean, that's not necessarily Sophocles' view of what tragedy is, but Aristotle's a pretty smart guy, so he's worth listening to. See what a beautiful thing he's done, because if she manifests herself as a divine law, what Creon says of her is that she's two things: raging horses and tempered steel. And so it looks as though she is natural. That's Antigone when she says, it's my nature, it's my nature not to hate with, but to love with. And so in a way, it's like saying, I don't have to justify. I just know this stuff on the one hand. And on the other hand, she says, I don't obey your law, but the divine law from Zeus, which means she's looking away from herself to some standard. So she combines within herself the tension that exists within the very notion of divine law. That's the first part of your question. That's why she represents. Now, then the second part was about the family. Antigone looks at the family and says, Creon, you don't understand. There's something so much deeper than what you represent. And I am going to tell you exactly what it is. It is the principle of the family. So she takes the thing that grounds human life and makes it possible. She says that it's different from Creon's understanding of law. And then in order to make her claim, she turns it into something that looks exactly like Creon's understanding of law, except higher, more. So it reminds me a little bit of what happens, and Plato does something very similar in the seventh book of the Republic, where he says, you know, we're all like creatures in a cave, and we are tied to a wall, and we can't see the real world, and so we see the shadows on the wall. And if we could only be forced to turn around and go outside, we'd see things in the light of the sun, and we'd see the real things. So in order to make a distinction between seeming and being, between opinion and knowledge, it looks as though he ties it to a poetic distinction between inside the cave and outside the cave. But the difficulty is, if you take that seriously, the problem is that you're just, I mean, when you're inside the cave, you see pale images, great. But it's still, when you're outside the cave and you look at the things as they really are, you only see one side of them. You don't see the other side. You can't see them from all around. We don't have any notion of what that would mean. So it turns out that the vision that you're using outside the cave is exactly like the vision you're using inside the cave. So it's an image which is designed to get you to believe that there's something more. And he means to do that, of course, but he treats the something more as though it's just like what's down here, except better.